assembly. In a moment, Joanne will be introducing our speaker. I just wanted to remind everyone that Mr. Stevenson's presentation, there will be 3 question and answer sessions in the McVeigh Community Room, periods F, A, and H. All students who are free are welcome to attend, and teachers are, of course, welcome to bring their classes. Also, after the presentation this morning, as you're leaving Yard Center, there are free calendars that are available to everybody. The calendars illustrate the struggle for justice and civil rights in the United States during the last 100 years. So we encourage everyone to take one of those calendars.
Good morning. It is my pleasure and privilege this morning to welcome Mr. Bryan Stevenson back to Germantown Academy. As a senior leader in community service here at GA, I am well aware of the many activities that CSO is committed to that are related to social justice. Whether we are working with the homeless at St. John's Hospice, with struggling people in the underserved community that face-to-face connects with on a regular basis, or the underprivileged kids at Silver Springs, our goal is to bring some semblance of hopes into their lives. Our guest today has made it his mission in life to bring hope to those that have been abandoned by a society that too often forgets about the poor and the disenfranchised, by a society that too often forgets that our nation must hold sacred the ideals of genuine liberty and justice for all, not just for some. Mr. Bryan Stevenson is the Executive Director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, a nonprofit organization working to improve justice and fairness in America for the poor, the disadvantaged, and the incarcerated. EJI provides legal assistance to condemned prisoners, people who have been wrongly convicted or unfairly sentenced, children in the criminal justice system, and the mentally ill and disabled facing imprisonment. Mr. Stevenson's organization is determined to eliminate racial inequality and to reduce poverty in the U.S. They advocate for more hopeful solutions to the violence, powerlessness, and despair that plague many marginalized communities. Mr. Stevenson has just written a book entitled Just Mercy. In this book, A Story of Justice and Redemption, he chronicles the work that his organization has done to move our great nation to become even greater, by simply reminding us that we must remember we are all our brother's keepers. The author, John Grisham, said the following about Mr. Stevenson. Not since Atticus Finch has a fearless and committed lawyer made such a difference in the American South. Though larger than life, Atticus Finch only exists in fiction. Mr. Bryan Stevenson, however, is very much alive, fighting for the poor, the oppressed, the voiceless, the vulnerable, the outcast, and those with no hope. His book, Just Mercy, is an inspiring and powerful story. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bryan Stevenson.
Very much. I'm really delighted to be back at Germantown Academy. I was here many years ago, about 10 years ago, and had a great experience, and I'm delighted to be back with you today. I want to talk about the challenges that we face in this country, but more than that, I want to talk about how I think you can change the world. And I'm quite sincere when I say that I do believe that each of you has the ability, the power, and the opportunity to fundamentally change things that you think are wrong, that you think are unfair, and that you think are unjust. When I was your age, I was sitting in a room just like this with real doubts about whether I could have an impact on the world around me. I grew up in a poor community. I started my education in a colored school. So when I was a little boy, black children weren't allowed to attend the public school. And in my county, there was no high school for black kids. My father couldn't go to high school because there wasn't a county for black children, a school for black children in our county. And then these lawyers came into the community, and they made them open up the public school for black kids. And because of their intervention, because they got involved, I had the chance to go to high school. I was so grateful for that opportunity. I just thought that was an end in and of itself. And it was only later that I realized that maybe if I pushed, if I did a few things, I could change the things that I cared about. And so for the last 30 years, I've been trying to say things about our criminal justice system. This country is a very different place than it was when I was in high school. In 1972, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. There are some 6 million people on probation or parole. There are 68 million Americans with criminal arrests, which means that when they apply for a job, their chance of employment is going to be compromised. We have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's imprisoned. The percentage of women who've gone to prison has increased 640% over the last 20 years. 70% of these women are mothers with minor children, and their children get scattered into foster care and other circumstances that tend not to go very well. The Bureau of Justice now reports that in the United States, 1 in 3 black male babies born is expected to go to jail or prison. 1 in 3. That wasn't true in the 20th century, that wasn't true in the 19th century, that became true in the 21st century. So I've been trying to talk about how I believe we should be doing better, how we can make a difference. I think that this era of mass imprisonment and excessive punishment has really been sustained and created by the politics of fear and anger. We've had decades of political leadership where everybody's trying to be tough on crime, everybody's competing with each other over who can be the toughest. And we've allowed some things to emerge that I think are profoundly unfair. But I really want to talk about why and how you can change the world, because whether you're concerned about racial inequality, whether you're concerned about criminal justice, whether you're concerned about the environment, or education equity, or income inequality, or gender issues, or international issues, I'm persuaded that your ability to change the world requires you to do 4 things. And the first is that you've got to commit yourself to get proximate to the things that matter to you. You cannot be a change agent. You can't actually advance justice from a distance. You've got to get up close. And proximity is important because proximity will teach you things about the issues you care about that you can't learn from a distance. You'll miss nuances. You won't hear some of the things that you need to hear. You'll overlook details if you try to make a difference in the world from a distance. Proximity, I am persuaded, is fundamental to how we become people who change the world. Over the last 30 years, my clients have gotten younger and younger and younger. I represent people, many of whom are younger than most of you. The United States has done some really significant things to expose children to the adult criminal justice system. Right now in America, we have 250,000 people serving long prison sentences for crimes they were accused of when they were children, when they were under the age of 17. There are some 3,000 children that have been sentenced to die in prison through life imprisonment without parole, some as young as 13 and 14 years of age. The state with the highest number of children sentenced to die in prison is Pennsylvania. Higher than any other state in the country, actually higher than any other jurisdiction in the world. And I've represented these 13 and 14-year-old children, but it was only when I got proximate that I began to understand the issues that these cases present. I got a call one day from a grandmother whose 14-year-old grandson had been in prison, and she asked me to get involved, and I got involved in this case. And this child was living in a house where his mother was repeatedly the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend, and when this boyfriend would start drinking, he'd sometimes come home and he'd become violent. And one day the man had been drinking, and he walked into the kitchen, he called the boy's mother in there, and he just punched this boy's mother in the face. And she fell and hit her head, and she collapsed on the floor, bleeding and unconscious. The little boy ran into the kitchen to try to help his mom recover, to try to revive his mom, and she was covered with blood, and he couldn't get her to wake up, he couldn't get her to move, he couldn't get her to respond, and after 10 minutes, this child thought his mom was dead. The man had gone into a bedroom and fallen asleep until the little boy got up, and he walked into the bedroom, and he walked over to a dresser drawer where he knew this man kept his handgun. And this little boy pulled the gun out of the dresser drawer, and he walked over to where the man was sleeping, and he stood there pointing the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring, and when the man stopped snoring, this child tragically pulled the trigger and shot the man in the head. The man died almost instantly. Very tragic. Now this kid was about 5 feet tall, he weighed under 100 pounds, he was very small for his age, but he'd never been in trouble before, he had no juvenile adjudications, he was actually a decent student. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, he was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult, and immediately certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they put him in the adult jail. Today, there are some 10,000 children, 17 and younger, in adult jails or prisons in this country. He'd been there 3 days before his grandmother called me, and she called me, and I went to the jail to go see this little boy, and I started asking him questions. I was really struck by how small he was. He walked in, he sat down. I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say anything. I asked him some more questions, and he just kept sitting there. And finally, I put my pen down, and I said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me. But he kept staring at the wall. There was a point where I got up, and I walked around the table, and I said, come on, you got to help me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. But he wouldn't say a word. I pulled my chair close to him, and I sat down, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. And he wouldn't say anything. And at some point, I started to lean on him. I don't even know why I started leaning on him. But there was this point where I felt him lean back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. And when I did that, this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, began talking to me not about what happened with his mom, not about what happened with the man. He started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night that he'd been there, several men had hurt him. Then he told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. Then he told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. And when I left that jail, I couldn't help asking myself, who was responsible for this? And I realized we are. We've allowed this narrative about the difference between children and adults to collapse. We've allowed our distance to the needs of many children in our society, poor kids in our society, kids struggling with abuse, kids struggling with violence in the home, kids struggling with a range of issues. We've allowed that to create policies and practices that are cruel and indecent and inhumane. I've now argued 3 cases before the United States Supreme Court to get the court to ban these sentences of life imprisonment without parole. And we won these cases, and we are making progress, but there is this need for me to stay proximate to the children in our society that are living in the margins. We have millions of children in this country that are born into violent families. They live in violent neighborhoods. They go to violent schools. They're chased by violent gangs. Their lives are shaped by violence. And by the time they're 6 and 7, you can see evidence of trauma and disruption. And at some point, living in this violent environment, they will react violently. And that tends to be the moment when we intervene. And so for me, I feel the need to change that. But that change is rooted in my conviction that proximity will create an understanding. It will create an ability to talk about these issues. It will create some reference that allows things to move. And it's difficult when you're a student to imagine the need to be proximate, but I'm going to urge you that even now, proximity is essential. I'm thrilled that you have these programs here that allow you to get engaged and involved in the needs of people who are disadvantaged, because that's a way to achieve proximity. You know, when I graduated from high school as a result of this intervention by the lawyers, I was so excited because it meant that I could go to college. And I went to college, went to Eastern University, not that far from here, and I had a great experience at Eastern. It was a beautiful campus, and I just had the time of my life. I was very active in sports, I was very active in music, and I could do sports and music and study, and I was a philosophy major, and probably unlike any of you, even in my senior year of college, I had no idea what I wanted to do when I graduated. In fact, the idea of graduation had not even occurred to me. And one day somebody came up to me and they said, well, what are you going to do after you graduate? And I heard this as a very hostile question because I hadn't really thought about it, and I was a philosophy major. And I realized at that moment that nobody was going to pay me to philosophize when I graduated from college. And that really was kind of a crisis for me, so I frantically started looking into graduate programs to extend my education. And what I realized then, which I'll tell you now in case you don't know, but I realized that if you do graduate work in history or English or political science or psychology, you actually have to know something about history, English, political science, or psychology. I didn't know that then, and so I was pretty intimidated by that, and that's the honest truth of how I found law school. Because the truth of it is, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. It's very true. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You don't need to know anything to go to law school, so that's why I signed up. And I found myself at Harvard Law School a couple of months into the first year of law school. And 3 months into it, I had this moment where I realized I'd made a really bad decision because they were talking about civil procedure and torts and contracts, but I went to law school because I was interested in racial justice. I was interested in doing something to eliminate poverty. I wanted to talk about justice, and it didn't seem like they were talking about that. And I decided to leave the law school. I finished my first year, and then I went to the Harvard School of Government and decided to pursue a degree in public policy. And I'd been there 2 or 3 months, and one day I sat down and I realized, oh my gosh, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. So I went back to the law school, and it was there that I had an opportunity to take an internship. In many ways, the same kind of internships that you have opportunities to do. My internship took me to the Deep South, and that's where I found an organization providing legal representation to people on death row. And it was proximity to the condemned that changed everything for me. I met people who were literally dying for legal assistance. Literally dying for legal assistance. I realized that we have a criminal justice system in this country that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. That wealth, not culpability, was shaping outcomes. And all of a sudden, it radicalized my interest in the law. When I left that internship, I went back to Harvard Law School, and you couldn't get me out of the law school library because I needed to know everything I could to help condemned people get to a place where justice was real. When I graduated, I started this work, and I've been doing it ever since, but I'm persuaded that proximity was essential to my ability to do what I've done. And it's not just that it helps you do things better, it actually helps you understand yourself in ways that you cannot understand yourself until you are proximate. The second thing I'm persuaded you have to do to change the world is that I'm persuaded that you have to change the narrative that surrounds us. You see, the problems that we are concerned about are sustained by a narrative. There is a story, sometimes not even articulated in our minds, that makes us think it is okay that we have some of the inequalities that we have, that we have some of the injustice that we have. You know, in the death penalty area, I do a lot of work on death penalty cases. And it's fascinating. I'm actually working on a case on Tuesday. I'm going to be in court. I've been representing a man who I'm absolutely persuaded is innocent. And he's been on death row for 29 years. Innocent. And we've got compelling evidence that proves his innocence, but I can't get anybody to do the right thing because there's a narrative in the back of the minds of these folks that suggests to them that this simply isn't a big deal. And that narrative has been crafted by indifference and a blindness to the costs and consequences of inequality and injustice. You know, for me, the death penalty isn't a question about whether people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed. For me, the question of the death penalty is, do we deserve to kill? If we have a system that's compromised by income inequality, if we have a system that's compromised by racial bias, if we have a system that's been corrupted by indifference, then the answer to that question is not the obvious one. And so this changing the narrative becomes really important. The reason why we have put children in adult jails and prisons is because there were criminologists 20 years ago going around arguing that some children aren't really children. They said that these kids may talk like kids, they may look like kids, they may sometimes act like kids, but don't be confused. They said these children are, quote, super predators. And they use that word to characterize a generation of children, mostly black and brown kids. And that narrative has to change. And whether you're talking about the environment, whether you're talking about a range of issues, that narrative, you've got to understand the narrative and you've got to change it. I'm trying to change the narrative when it comes to race. All of you have inherited in this country a legacy of racial inequality. And it haunts us, and it will continue to haunt us. It will create moments of distrust and confusion and conflict that are hard to understand, but they're hard to understand because we are still living in the shadow of this history. I live in Montgomery, Alabama, and if you come to Montgomery, you'll see a community that loves talking about mid-19th century life. We've got 59 monuments and memorials to the Confederacy. Every street corner, there's a memorial to Jefferson Davis or a monument about the Civil War or something that romanticizes that era in our history. Our two largest high schools are Jefferson Davis High and Robert E. Lee High. They're both 99% black. State of Alabama, Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. It's not Martin Luther King Day in Alabama. It's Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. It's a segregated holiday. And we don't talk about it. And because we don't talk about it, we haven't made the progress I think we should make. We are actually talking about slavery. The calendars that we have available to you tell this story about our history. And for me, I think we need to talk differently about slavery because the experience of enslavement in America was quite unique. We weren't a country like other countries. Other countries had slavery, there's no dispute about it. They had slavery in Africa. But those were mostly societies with slaves. We became something unique. We became a slave society. We actually created an ideology, a narrative of racial difference to make us feel that slavery was okay. And this narrative created a disruption in our thinking about people based on their color. It was rooted in this kind of white supremacy. And the truth is that the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation didn't do anything with the true evil of slavery. For me, the true evil of slavery was this narrative of racial difference, not involuntary servitude. And while we ended involuntary servitude, we didn't really end the evil of slavery. In my judgment, slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. It turned into decades of racial hierarchy and bias and bigotry. We've just put out a report about lynching, because I'm persuaded that this era between Reconstruction and World War II was defined by terrorism in this country. In fact, older people of color come up to me sometimes and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get so angry when I hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism. For the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They say, we grew up with terror, we grew up with violence, we had to worry about being lynched and menaced and threatened, and that threat of terror shaped our lives. My grandmother moved from Virginia to Germantown, Philadelphia, beginning of the 20th century because she was fleeing lynching and terrorism. You've got people of color in Philadelphia, and Boston, and Cleveland, and Chicago, and Detroit, and Los Angeles, and Oakland, and most of us don't realize that these communities of color came here not as immigrants looking for opportunity, but as refugees from terrorism. Even the civil rights movement, I think we haven't talked about in a way that we have to. I believe we've got to talk more truthfully about these issues. You know, I listen to the conversations about civil rights in so many schools, and it just strikes me that it's so celebratory. We love to celebrate this era of American history. It's almost as if the civil rights movement was this 3-day event. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we just changed all these laws. And it's astonishing, because if that were true, we're a really great society, right? But the truth of it is that for decades, people of color were humiliated and excluded and burdened and traumatized. And we haven't talked about that. We haven't really dealt with that. And so now there is this presumption of guilt and dangerousness that we assign to too many people based on their color. It's the reason why people are protesting in Ferguson. It's the reason why there is this disconnect. This presumption of dangerousness and guilt can overwhelm you. I've argued 6 cases before the United States Supreme Court. I graduated from Harvard Law School. I have all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. But I've been pulled out of my car by a police officer who pointed a gun at me and threatened to blow my head off because he thought I was a dangerous person. These presumptions of dangerous and guilt create all kinds of challenges for us. I was in court not too long ago, actually, in the Midwest. I was getting ready to do a hearing. I had my suit on. I was sitting there at court counsel's table, and I was just there early, first time I'd been there. And the judge walked out, and the judge saw me sitting at the counsel table, and he looked over and he said, hey, you get out of here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyers. You go back out there in the hallway and wait until your lawyer gets here. And I stood up and I said, oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh too, because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. Then my client came in. It was a 17-year-old kid, a white kid I was representing at this hearing. We did the hearing, but afterward I was sitting in my car thinking, what is it that when this judge sees a middle-aged black man in a suit and a tie at counsel table, it doesn't occur to him that that's the lawyer? What is it? Well, it's this legacy that we fail to confront. I am persuaded that we've got to commit ourselves to truth and reconciliation, to change the narrative. If you go to Germany, you are forced to confront the legacy of the Holocaust because there are markers and monuments at the places where Jewish families were abducted and taken away. You're encouraged to go to the concentration camps and reflect soberly on the horrors of the Holocaust. In South Africa, there's a recognition that after apartheid, there had to be truth and reconciliation. And yet in this country, we haven't done it. For me, to change the world,
means to change the narrative of the issues that I care most deeply about, to get behind these problems, to understand what's being said and what's not being said. The third thing I think you have to do, and I should warn you, these get harder as I go along. I'm sorry about that. The third thing I think you have to do if you really want to change the world is that I am persuaded that you have got to protect your hopefulness. Now you would think, because you're in high school, because you're at this great academy, because you're in the circumstances that you're in, it's really easy to be hopeful. But I actually know that when you're trying to make a difference, when you're trying to be somebody who's actually trying to do the right thing, when you actually are concerned about justice and equality, it's really hard to stay hopeful. Because everybody's going to try to persuade you that those ideas you have are simply not realistic. Many of you will go off to college, and when you get to college, you're going to have courses that are designed to complicate the world you think you're entering. They're designed to make you think that the things you can do are going to be much harder, and they are harder than we sometimes appreciate, but it's important that you protect your hopefulness. You see, I think the people who change the world are not people with great ideas necessarily. You've got to have great ideas. You've got to be smart. You've got to be informed. You've got to be strategic. You've got to be tactical. You need the ideas in your mind to make things happen. But the people who change the world are the people who let the ideas in their mind get fueled by some conviction in their heart. They're the people who believe things that they haven't seen. And that requires a kind of hopefulness. And it's hard to stay hopeful when everybody else is trying to push you to believe that what you're trying to do can't be done. But I'm persuaded that you have to protect that. Some of you are going to have to be the people who speak when everybody else is quiet. Some of you are going to have to be the people who stand when everybody else remains sitting. But that instinct to do that thing that is necessary, I want you to hold on to. And we're all vulnerable to different kinds of things that make us hopeless. I will admit that because I grew up in a part of the country where we had to confront segregation and Jim Crow and a lot of overt racial bias, I am really turned around. Living in Alabama, when I see these images of the Old South, I don't like the Confederate flags. It really bothers me. I don't like it when I hear people talking about the good old days. I don't like it when we're silent about our history of racial inequality. These are the things that burden me. And I was going to a prison not too long ago, and I parked my car at this prison, and there was a truck outside the prison yard that was like a shrine to the Old South. It was this truck covered with bumper stickers and Confederate flags. It had the gun rack, and I looked at this truck, and it just challenged me. There was a bumper sticker on this truck I actually hadn't seen before. This bumper sticker read, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own cotton." I'd never seen that one before. And I was just really kind of discouraged by it. But I went past the truck, and I went up to the front gate of the prison. There was a white guard standing there, and I said, "Hi, I'm here for a legal visit." And this guard looked at me, and he said, "You're not a lawyer." I said, "Well, yes, sir, I am. I've been to this prison before." He said, "I don't believe you're a lawyer." I said, "No, sir, I'm a lawyer." He said, "Well, show me your bar card." I said, "Well, my bar card is back in the car." He said, "Well, you have to go get it." So he made me go back to my car to get my bar card to prove to him that I was an attorney. I was really insulted by it, but I went back there, got the card, came back, I showed him the card. I said, "Okay, here's my card. I want to see my client now." I was trying to regain some advantage here. And he says, "All right, well, you're going to have to get in the bathroom. I'm going to give you a strip search." I said, "No, sir, lawyers don't get a strip search when they come into this prison. You come into my prison, you're going to get in that bathroom, and you're going to get a strip search." I couldn't get anybody to help me, so I just agreed to do it. I'd driven 3 hours to be at this prison. I went into the bathroom. Strip search is really humiliating. They make you take off all of your clothes. They make you do these really sort of just humiliating things. And this man was really nasty and difficult, but I subjected myself to this strip search, and I put my clothes back on. I walked back out, and I said, "No, I want to see my client now." I was trying to recover some dignity. And then the man said to me, "Well, you've got to go back there and sign the book." I said, "Lawyers that come to this prison don't have to sign that book." He said, "Well, if you're coming into my prison, you're going to go back there and sign the book." So I did. I went back and signed the book, and finally this man led me to the door that would let me get into the visitation room. He unlocked the door, and I was about to walk in, and he grabbed me by the arm and said, "Hey, let me ask you something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Did you see that truck out there with all of those bumper stickers and all those flags and that gun rack?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that truck." He said, "I want you to know that that's my truck." Really difficult guy. I was really angry when I went inside. I was waiting to meet a client I'd never met before. And this man came out, a disabled African-American man. He came out as the client. He sat down, and the first thing that this man asked me when he sat down was, quote, "Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake?" And I thought to myself, this is the strangest day I've had in a really long time. I said, no, I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake. I'm your lawyer. I'm here to represent you. And I started asking him my questions, but he wasn't paying attention to a thing I said. And finally, after 10 minutes, I realized he was hung up on this milkshake, so I put my pen down. I said, look, I'm sorry, I didn't know you wanted me to bring you a chocolate milkshake. Next time I come, if they let me, I'll bring you a chocolate milkshake. And this man smiled and smiled and smiled. He was terribly disabled, horribly abused as a child. He grew up in the foster care system. He was actually in 29 foster homes by the time he was 10 years old. And when he was 11, his foster parents took him out in the woods, tied him to a tree, and left him there. By the age of 13, he was showing signs of bipolar disorder. By the age of 14, he was schizophrenic. He started using crack cocaine because he couldn't get medical care that he needed to manage all of these horrific emotions. By the time he was 15, he was addicted to crack. He started using heroin at 16. By the time he was 17, he was homeless and roaming the streets and beginning to have psychotic episodes. And in the midst of a psychotic episode at the age of 19, he committed a horrific, brutal crime. They arrested him, charged him with capital murder, quickly convicted him, and sentenced him to death. I got the record, and I read through the record looking for evidence of some mitigation, and there wasn't anything in the record about mental health, mental disease, mental disability. Well, we got involved in the case and decided to put on a complete case to try to show that his conviction was unfair, and we got experts involved, we got some witnesses involved, and it was time to go to court. I was really hopeful about this case, and I drove to court, and there was my client, but there was this guard who I hadn't seen in a really long time, standing in the courtroom. I went to my client, explained to him I couldn't get him a milkshake, which is what I had to always do, and to just get him to focus. And then we spent 3 days in court putting on our case, and our experts did well, the witnesses did well. And about a month later, I decided to go back to the prison and see my client, and I drove down there, parked my car, and what do I see in the parking lot but that man's truck? Hadn't dealt with him since that first encounter. And I almost decided to come back a different day. But I started hearing that song they used to sing when I was a little kid in the civil rights movement. They used to sing this song, "Can't let nobody turn me around, turn me around." And when I heard that, I just decided I couldn't just turn around. So I got my bar card and I went up to the prison door, and sure enough, there was the guard standing in the front of the prison. I said, "Hi, I'm here for a legal visit. Here's my bar card." And the man immediately said to me, he said, "Hello, Mr. Stevenson. How are you?" He threw me. I said, "I'm fine." I said, "I'll go in the bathroom and get ready for your search." He said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we're not going to do that today." I said, "Well, thank you." So I'll go over here and sign the book. He said, "Mr. Stevenson, I saw you coming and I signed you in." Really threw me. I said, "Well, thank you." He said, "Yes, sir," and he led me over to the door, and I was standing there watching him try to unlock the door, but his hands were shaking. He couldn't get the hand with the key to stay still enough to put the key in the lock. Both of his hands were shaking. I stood there watching him try to unlock this door, and I was concerned because I couldn't figure out what was going on. And finally, he got the key in the lock. He unlocked the door. But when he looked up at me, his face was red. I thought he was about to cry. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I have to say something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I just want you to know that I was in that courtroom and I was listening." And then he said, I want you to know that I think what you're doing is a good thing." He said, "I grew up in the foster care system too." He said, "I had it really bad." He said, "I didn't think anybody had it as bad as I did, but I realized that maybe your client had it worse than I do, and I just want you to know that I think what you're doing is a good thing." He said, "I'm a really angry person. I've been angry my whole life, but I just feel the need to tell you, you keep doing what you're doing." And then this man put his hand out. He said, "Sir, can I please shake your hand?" Would have never guessed it. Would have never predicted it. And I put my hand up and I said, "Thank you. It means the world to me that you said that." I turned to go into the prison to see my client. The man grabbed me by the arm. He said, wait, I got to tell you something else." I said, "What's that?" He said, "Well, I just want you to know I did something on the way back from the courthouse." I said, "What'd you do?" "Well, I was driving back to the prison and I decided to take an exit, and I took your client to a Wendy's and I bought him a chocolate milkshake." It's a really silly story, but for me it's an important story about our need to stay hopeful about what we can do. When you hear people saying, well, these people can't do that, and these people can't do this, I think we need in this world, in this community, people who have the conviction and the heart to say, no, that's not true. We can make a difference. Fourth and finally, I believe to change the world, it's not only necessary to be proximate, it's not only necessary to change the narrative, it's not only necessary to be hopeful, but the hardest thing, it's necessary to do things that are uncomfortable. I wish it weren't the case. Because we love comfort, all of us. Human beings are programmed to do what's comfortable. We are. We intuitively kind of think that way. And I'm not against comfort, don't get me wrong. I like comfort too. I was giving a talk down in Mississippi, and I got off the plane, and people came up to me and they said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you, we've read about you, we know what kind of person you are, and we're having a conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. So we've asked one of the farmers if they'll put you up at the barn." And I said, "What is wrong with you? Of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel." That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to choose to do the thing that is uncomfortable because it's the necessary thing to create justice, to create truth, to create progress. And it's hard. It's hard, it's hard, I know it. But it's necessary. I've been representing people on death row for 30 years. And when you represent people on death row, it can sometimes be overwhelming. You can have moments where you just feel like, gosh, this is so painful. Between 2009 and 2011, we had 17 executions in the state of Alabama. We don't have a public defender system. We don't provide lawyers for people after their convictions are affirmed. And so my staff and I were trying to help all of these people facing execution dates. When I left here on Wednesday, we had 3 more people scheduled for execution. When I go back next week, we're going to have to deal with this again. And my young lawyers were representing these people, and they were just getting beat down by the experience. And I jumped in and said, look, I'm going to take the next couple of cases. And I got involved with a case of a man who was intellectually disabled. He had mental retardation. And you're not allowed to execute people with intellectual disability in this country, but because the lawyers had never raised the issue, all the courts were saying, too late, too late, too late. And I tried to persuade these courts that this man could not legally be executed, but everybody said, too late. And on the day he was scheduled to be executed, I got this call from the Supreme Court telling me that the last stay motion had been denied. And I was on the phone talking to this man shortly before the execution, and it was heartbreaking. In addition to being intellectually disabled, this man also had a very severe speech impediment. And whenever he got nervous or anxious, he couldn't get his words out. And I was trying to talk to him, but he was so overwhelmed and so anxious he couldn't get his words out. And he told me not to get off the phone until he thanked me, but he couldn't get his words out. And I was standing there holding the phone while this man was struggling valiantly to talk. And it was just breaking my heart, breaking my heart. He couldn't get his words out. He kept trying. We were getting closer to the time of the execution, and I was standing there holding the phone, and tears were running down my face. And all of a sudden, I remembered something I'd forgotten until that night. I remembered how when I was about 9 years old, my mother took me to church one Sunday, and I was there with my friends, and we were talking, and there was a skinny little boy who I'd never seen before at the church, and he wasn't saying anything. And at some point, I asked him where he was from or what his name was or something like that. And I remembered that night how when I asked this child that question, the little boy couldn't get his words out. He also had a very severe speech impediment. And I remember how he tried to answer my question and he couldn't, and I did something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mother saw me laughing at this little boy, and she came over and grabbed me by the arm. She gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she pulled me aside and she said, "Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that." I tried to apologize. She said, "No, Bryan, you know better than that." And then my mother said, "Now I want you to go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry." I said, "Okay, Mom." And I took a step and she grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait. After you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy." Kind of rolled my eyes. I said, "Okay, Mom, I'll do that." And I took a step and she said, "Wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him." I said, "Mom, I cannot go over there and tell that little boy." She gave me that look again, so I did. I went over to this little boy and I walked up to him and I said, "Look, man, I'm sorry." And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And then what I remembered that night that I'd forgotten was how I remembered saying to this little boy, as insincerely as I possibly could, I remember saying to him, "Look, man, I love you." And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back and whispered in my ear flawlessly. He said, "I love you too." I'd forgotten that until I heard this man on the phone trying to get out his words before the execution. And finally he got to the point where he could get his words out. And he said, "I just want to thank you for representing me. I want to thank you for fighting for me." And then he said, "I love you for trying to save my life." I hung up the phone and my first thought was, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. It's too uncomfortable, too painful, too hard. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And I couldn't answer this question. I kept thinking to myself, why do we want to kill all the broken people? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to kill it? And then I realized that my life is filled with brokenness. All of my clients are broken. Broken people, people broken by poverty, people broken by disability, people broken by racism, people broken by neglect, people broken by cynicism. And then I realized I work in a broken system of justice. People too cynical about what they can do, people despairing, people too distant to see the inequality. Broken, broken, broken. I realized my life is filled with brokenness, and I said, I don't want to do this no more. No more. And I had this conversation with myself where I asked myself, well, why have you been doing this? If you're going to give it up, you need to know what you're giving up. And I realized something I'd never realized before. I realized that I don't do what I do because it's important. I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because somebody has to do it. I don't do what I do because I get to talk to wonderful people like you. I don't do what I do because there's money, there's no money. I don't do what I do because there's a chance to make a difference. I realized something that I had never realized before. I realized that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth of it is that if you want to change the world, if you get proximate, if you change narratives, if you stay hopeful and you do uncomfortable things, it will break you. You'll pick up little cuts and fractures and scissors that will make you understand things that you can't understand otherwise. But I also realized that in my brokenness, I'm not trying to save condemned people, I'm trying to save myself. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing you've ever done. I think that for you, I think that for my clients. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. I also believe that in this country, in this community, I'm not persuaded that the opposite of poverty is wealth. We talk too much about wealth in this country. Wealth here and wealth there. I am persuaded that in America, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I'm persuaded that the opposite of poverty is justice. And finally, I believe that when I come to Pennsylvania, when I come to a community like this, I can't judge how we're doing by how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. I think you judge a community, you judge a society by how it treats the poor, the incarcerated, and the condemned. There is a different metric system, but for those of you who want to change the world. And I'll end with this. That metric system requires that we sometimes think about what matters differently. I was in a church giving a talk, and an older man came into the back of the church. He was in a wheelchair, and he was staring at me. And I was really kind of unnerved because he kept staring at me. I got through my talk, and at the end of the talk, and the little boy wheeled this man up to me, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I didn't know how to answer. And then he said it one more time. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I couldn't figure out how to respond. And then he says, "Do you know what you're doing?" Then he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this older black man looked at me and he says, "You're beating the drum for justice." And it really moved me. He said, "You keep beating the drum for justice." And then he said, "Come here, come here, come here." And he grabbed me by my jacket. He pulled me into his wheelchair. He turned his head. He said, "I'm going to show you something." And he said, "You see the scar behind my right ear?" He says, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this cut down here?" He said, "I got that cut in Philadelphia, Mississippi during Freedom Summer." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise during the Children's Crusade, Birmingham, Alabama." And then he said, "People look at me, they think I'm some old man in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts, these aren't my bruises, these aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." The things that honor us are the things that sometimes are hardest to do. They're the things that happen when people get proximate and change narratives and stay hopeful and do uncomfortable things. They're the things I hope you'll embrace. Because that's the legacy that I think most honors the kind of society we want to live in. And I'm grateful and excited that so many of you have the talent and conviction and ability to do exactly that. And I feel really privileged to have had this opportunity to be with you. Thank you very much.